That afternoon, the sky over Charleston seemed to collapse. Rain poured down, thunder roared. I was making tea when I heard a frantic knock on the door. When I opened it, I froze. My son and the daughter-in-law who once threw me out were standing there, soaked to the bone, dragging two worn-out suitcases. 3 months ago, they left me to live in the lavish mansion of her millionaire mother, the same place where I was called a poor old woman unworthy of being anyone's mother. But now here they were, their eyes filled with panic instead of pride, begging to be let in. They thought I'd open my arms like before. What they didn't know was that 3 months of silence had taught me to rise, not through hatred, but through strength and dignity. Because in this story, the one who once seemed weak is the very person who will make the betrayers bow their heads. Listen till the end, for when that door closes, karma begins to knock. I still remember that day. The day everything inside me fell apart without a single scream. It was a sweltering May afternoon in Charleston. The sunlight spilled across the porch of my old wooden house while the chicken soup simmered quietly in the kitchen. I had set the table, laid out a clean cloth, and prepared dinner for the 3 of us like always. But that dinner never happened. The door opened, and Candace, my daughter-in-law, walked in wearing a designer dress, her hair softly curled, her eyes cold as steel. Behind her was Devin, my only son, carrying a cardboard box. I smiled, thinking they brought something home. But then Candace said a sentence that froze my heart. "We're moving out, Mom." Mother Vivian invited us to live with her. It's better for our future. I looked at Devin, hoping for an explanation, but he just lowered his head, avoiding my eyes. "My son," I whispered. "This is your home. Every brick, every table here was built by my own hands. Why are you leaving?" Candace laughed, a laugh that clawed straight into my chest. "You really think your son deserves to live his whole life in this shabby place? My mother's house has a pool, staff, everything. Here, there's nothing but damp air and the sound of wind through old windows." Devin stayed silent. He always did. When Candace spoke, he just bowed his head. I looked at the boy I'd raised alone for more than 30 years. After my husband died in the scaffold accident, I took bookkeeping jobs at night, saving every penny so Devin could go to college. I never complained. I thought one day he'd understand. But that day, he couldn't even look at me. Candace kept packing, opening drawers, tossing the clothes I had folded neatly onto the chair. "Babe, leave these cheap things behind. We don't need them." I bit my lip hard. I wasn't someone who lost her temper easily, but for the first time in my life I wanted to scream. Still, I didn't. I knew that if I broke down, it would only give them more reason to look down on me. "My son," I said quietly. "Remember when I was sick? Who stayed up through the night caring for you? Who paid your first tuition when your scholarship fell through? I don't have a mansion, but I have love." Devon answered softly, his voice almost lifeless. "I know, Mom. But I have to think about the future." "The future?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "What kind of future teaches you to turn your back on the one who raised you?" Candace sniffed, zipping the suitcase, then turned toward me. "The kind of future he deserves, not stuck in this working-class neighborhood. You should learn to let go instead of clinging to a grown man." When they walked out, I stood frozen, flour still on my hands from kneading dough. I didn't cry. My throat just burned as if filled with stones. Candace opened the car door, a shiny black sedan her mother had lent them, and looked back, her red lips curling. "Stay here and breathe in your dust. A woman like you will never belong in our world." Her words hit like thunder under a clear sky. Devin said nothing. He just loaded the suitcases into the trunk and got in the car. I only managed to whisper, so faint that even I barely heard it. "Go. But one day you'll learn. Happiness doesn't live in a big house." The car rolled away, its tires grinding over gravel. I stood there for a long time until the taillights disappeared. Across the street, Mrs. Carol Jenkins opened her window, watching me with worried eyes. I forced a smile, pretending everything was fine, then went back inside. Dinner for 3 still sat on the table, steam rising from the soup. I pulled out a chair and stared at the food, now only for one person. In that familiar kitchen, the wall clock kept ticking, but for me, time had stopped. That night, I couldn't sleep. Rain drummed on the tin roof like cruel laughter. I opened my phone. No messages, no calls. Candace's social media was full of pictures. The mansion, the pool, champagne parties. Beside her, Devon smiled faintly, holding a glass of wine. I stared at that photo for a long time. What hurt most wasn't Candace. It was my son's eyes. They were no longer the eyes I knew. The next day, neighbors started whispering. "Did you hear? Mrs. Whitford's son moved into his rich mother-in-law's house. Good for him. He won't have to struggle anymore." I heard them, but I didn't reply. I just swept the porch and cleaned the yard, as if silence could somehow protect the last bit of dignity I had left. A week later, Mrs. Carroll brought over an apple pie. She sat down and held my hand. "Eleanor, don't be sad. Kids lose their way sometimes. He'll understand one day." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Mrs. Carroll, sooner or later, everyone must learn how to stand alone." That night, I stood before the mirror, looking at my graying hair and wrinkled skin. "I really am getting old," I whispered. But then I realized something. I still had a heart, and I still had this home, the one place I truly owned. No one could take that from me unless I let them. I opened my late husband's old notebook and began to write. Day 1. Devin is gone. But I still have myself. I won't cry anymore. I closed the book and turned off the light, but my heart was pounding. I knew my life would change from that moment on. I didn't know what waited ahead, only that the woman once called useless would never be the same again. Because sometimes, betrayal is a strange kind of gift. It teaches you how to live again, with your own hands, your own strength, your own faith. And if you've ever been betrayed by family, looked down on, or stood alone in the rain like I did, remember this. Silence isn't weakness. It's the beginning of strength. And if my story touched your heart, hit the like button and comment number 1, so I'll know that somewhere out there are hearts that understand a mother's pain like mine. That night, I barely slept. I lay there listening to the rain tapping on the tin roof, each drop marking the slow passage of time. Every time I closed my eyes, Devin's face appeared, his smile as a little boy, the way he ran home to show me his award-winning drawing, the way he hugged me when his father died. Then those memories faded, replaced by the image of him now, standing beside Candace, eyes avoiding mine, letting his wife insult me without a word. That pain twisted inside me like a knife, dull, deep, and endless. At dawn, I got up as usual, made a pot of tea and stepped onto the porch. The sun rose behind the old rooftops, lighting up every patch of peeling paint on the wall. That's when I saw how worn down my house truly looked. For the first time, I felt ashamed. Not of being poor, but of letting others make me believe that poverty was something to be ashamed of. In the days that followed, whispers filled the neighborhood. At the grocery store, I overheard two women murmuring, "Poor Mrs. Whitford. Her son ran off with the rich family. Poor? At least he's smart enough to chase a better life." I pretended not to hear, gripping my shopping basket tighter. When I got home, I shut the door, leaned against the wall, and sighed. Some humiliations don't need words. Just a pitying look is enough to make them hurt. One evening, I heard noises outside. I stepped out and saw the wall sprayed with red paint. "You were abandoned." The words glowed under the yellow streetlight like an open wound. I grabbed a bucket of water and a brush and started scrubbing. The water was icy, my hands shook, but I kept cleaning until the wall was bare again. When I finished, I stood there, water running over my feet, and whispered to myself, "No one gets to define me through their pity." From that day on, I started waking earlier. I trimmed the rose garden my late husband used to tend. The leaves were wilted, the branches broken. I cut away the dead parts and left only the tiny green buds. I wasn't sure if I was doing it for the flowers or for myself. Maybe both. By Saturday, I went to the farmer's market with a few jars of homemade apple jam. Standing among the chatter and laughter of other women, I realized how long I had been silent. I said hello to a woman nearby. Her name was Ruth, a widow who sold pies. After a short chat, she smiled and said, "You should bring more next time. This jam is really good." I smiled back, feeling a small warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe the world hadn't turned its back on me after all. But when night came, loneliness crept in again like fog. I sat on the couch, the TV flickering, not really watching. Outside, the crickets sang. I imagined Devin sitting in that grand mansion beside his silk-draped wife. I didn't know if he was happy. But something inside me had changed. No more waiting, no more tears. I began to think that maybe it was time to live for myself. One afternoon, while watering the flowers, Mrs. Carroll came over with a cup of coffee and a newspaper. "Eleanor," she said, "I heard your son might be joining his mother-in-law's company. You must be proud." I smiled softly, not bitterly this time. If he's truly happy, then I'm glad for him. But if he's not, life will teach him. Mrs. Carroll paused, then nodded. "You're stronger than I thought." I looked out at the sun shining through the trees. Not stronger. Just done being the victim of my own life. That evening, I opened my husband's old notebook. On the first page, he had once written, "When you lose what you love most, rebuild your life with your own hands." I added my own line. Day 10. I've cleaned the wall. Maybe it's time to clean my memories, too. The next day, I went to the hardware store. While picking out paint, I met a young man named Marcus who worked there. Kind and cheerful. When I said I wanted to repaint the house myself, he looked surprised. "By yourself? That's a lot of work, ma'am." I smiled. I raised a son on my own. Holding a paint roller won't be the hardest thing I've done. Marcus laughed and helped me choose a soft jade green color. Back home, I started painting one wall at a time. The scent of fresh paint mixed with the old wood, making the house feel alive again. I paused for a moment, looked at my paint-stained hands, and thought, maybe the best way to forget pain is to tire yourself out building something new. By evening, I cleaned the porch and stepped back. The new color gleamed under the sunset, reflecting off the window glass. For the first time in years, I felt this house truly belonged to me, not as a place to wait for someone's return, but as the home I chose to live in. That night, I made tea and sat outside. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of roses. I scrolled through my phone and saw photos of Candace and her mother at a charity gala, all smiles and diamonds. but in Devon's eyes I saw exhaustion. I looked for a long time, then turned off the screen. I didn't know where their path would lead, but I knew mine no longer depended on them. In the garden, the roses I trimmed yesterday had begun to bloom. I smiled and whispered to myself, maybe this season, the flowers will bloom brighter. If you were me, a mother betrayed and looked down on, what would you do? Would you open the door when they come back, or stay silent and let them learn their own lesson? Tell me in the comments, do you agree or disagree with my choice? I truly want to hear your feelings, because sometimes it's your stories that remind me. I'm not the only one who's ever stood alone in the storm. I looked at the roses on my porch, their petals trembling gently in the breeze, and realized it had been a long time since I'd felt this kind of peace. Not because life suddenly got better, but because I was finally learning how to live without waiting for anyone to come back. Yet as I looked around the house, I knew there was still something left to do, to renew it, just as I was renewing my own life. The next morning I went back to the hardware store. Marcus, the young man from before, was loading paint cans onto a truck. He smiled when he saw me.
Back again, ma'am?
Run out of paint already? I laughed. Not yet. I'm thinking of changing the floors and the doors. I want the house to be brighter. Marcus tilted his head. When the house brightens up, the heart usually does too, right? I nodded softly. Maybe so. We picked out more paint, a few new wood panels for the windows, and a small porch light. I liked how Marcus talked. Simple, genuine, never nosy, never pitying. He treated me like a normal person, not like someone to feel sorry for, which was more kindness than most had shown me in months. That afternoon I got to work. Each brushstroke felt like I was washing away a piece of the past. I repainted the old door a shade of turquoise, the color of hope. I hung new curtains, lit a lavender candle by the window. In the soft golden glow, the house looked different, no longer haunted by memories, but alive with new beginnings. Later that evening, Marcus stopped by to return an extra paint can. He looked around and said, "You did all this by yourself? It looks amazing." I smiled, wiping my hands. Old houses just need a little care to breathe again. People are the same. He paused, studying me for a moment. There aren't many like you. Most people just complain when they're left behind. You chose to rebuild. I replied quietly. Because I don't want my story to end in bitterness. I want my son, when he finally returns, to see that his mother is no victim. When Marcus left, I watched his figure disappear beneath the streetlight and felt a small warmth in my chest. I didn't know what waited ahead, but for the first time, I truly believed I could take charge of my life. One Sunday morning, while painting the fence, Mrs. Carroll came over with a basket of pies. "Eleanor! My goodness, look at your house. It's like it's come back to life." I laughed. I just needed a change. Turns out, repainting a house makes you feel like you're repainting your soul, too. She set the basket down and sat on the steps. They say fresh paint drives away old energy. Maybe Candace could learn a thing or two from you, I chuckled softly. Sometimes, people have to lose everything before they start learning, Carol. She nodded, eyes thoughtful. I just hope your son realizes that before it's too late. That afternoon, sunlight slanted through the windows. I opened an old photo album. There was one picture of the three of us at Devon's graduation, me, him, and an empty space beside us where his father should have been. I touched my son's smiling face. His innocence hurt to look at. But instead of crying, I closed the album. Not because I'd forgotten, but because it was time to let go. The next day, Marcus and I took the leftover wood to the backyard and built a small table and chair set. He joked, "If you opened a little cafe here, I bet people would line up." I laughed. "I just need a place to sit and watch my roses in the afternoon."
He looked at me kindly.
You know, sometimes the people who've suffered the most end up knowing best how to live beautifully. I fell silent. Maybe he was right. Pain teaches you to appreciate every small thing that survives it. That evening, I sat on the new chair, tea in hand, listening to the crickets sing. Moonlight spilled across the freshly painted fence, still faintly scented with paint. I looked around. The house didn't seem old anymore. It looked like me, once broken, now reborn. I still thought of Devin sometimes. I didn't hate him. I just hoped that one day he'd see that his mother was never someone who needed saving. She was someone who learned to stand tall in the storm. That night, I wrote in my notebook, Day 20. I'm no longer waiting for anyone. I'm waiting to become whole. I closed the book and felt lighter than I had in years. Another morning, Ruth, the woman I'd met at the market, stopped by with a basket of cookies.
Heard you've been painting your house?
She said. I had to see it for myself. When she saw it, she gasped. "Oh my, it's beautiful." That color is so calming. I invited her in for tea, and we talked for hours. Ruth told me about her late husband, how she overcame the loneliness by baking. I listened, realizing that everyone carries their own scars. They just heal in different ways. When Ruth left, I sat alone, looking around my home, every corner marked by my own hands. Pride filled my chest. I whispered, "Devin, my dear, I'm still here." I'm still living well, even without you. A gentle wind brushed past, carrying rose petals onto the porch steps. I bent down, picked one up, and smiled. Maybe this was what freedom truly felt like. Not the absence of people, but the absence of fear that they might leave. If you've ever rebuilt your life piece by piece, painted your own walls, started over with trembling hands, you'll understand how priceless this feeling is. And if you believe that anyone can rise again from the ruins, hit that subscribe button so you won't miss my next chapter. The journey of a mother who learned to stand tall through betrayal and found herself again. Because maybe, somewhere in my story, you'll find a piece of yours too. The next day, I got a call I didn't expect. It was Jasmine Carter, an old friend I used to work with at the accounting office more than 20 years ago. Her voice was still steady and warm, though now it carried the calm strength of someone who'd weathered many storms. "Eleanor," she said, "Carol told me about your son. I've got some time this week. How about we meet for coffee?" I hesitated for a moment, then agreed. Maybe it was time to finally speak my heart to someone who would really listen. We met at a small cafe near downtown Charleston. Jasmine walked in wearing a light gray suit, her hair neatly curled, her eyes bright. When she hugged me, I caught the faint scent of lavender, her favorite perfume since the old days. "How long has it been?" she laughed. 25 years, I said, but it feels like yesterday. We talked about old times, our younger days, and eventually the conversation drifted to our children. When I told her about Devin and Candace, Jasmine stayed quiet for a long time. She didn't interrupt, just listened, her eyes full of empathy and that quiet sadness only those who understand can show. "Eleanor," she said firmly, What they did to you isn't just betrayal. It's called elder abandonment, neglecting an older dependent. Even if you don't need their money or care, the law still protects you. I blinked, surprised. The law really protects me? Of course, Jasmine nodded. But more importantly, you must protect yourself. You have the house papers, right? I do, I said softly. But I never thought I'd need them. We'll start thinking about it, she said gently.
Because believe me, when they run out of money, they'll come back. And when they do, you need to be the one holding the keys, not just to your house, but to your future. Her words hit me hard. I'd never thought about the legal side, only the emotional pain. But Jasmine was right. Silence wasn't weakness. Sometimes, silence was preparation. She reached into her bag and handed me a business card. I'm still practicing family law. Come by my office this week. We'll redo your will, register homestead protection, and secure your property rights. You have nothing to fear. I looked down at the card, Carter and Associates Law Firm. And for the first time in months, I felt something solid under my feet. That afternoon, I went to Jasmine's office. The air smelled of new paper and fresh coffee. She handed me a folder. We'll update everything. You just have to sign. I looked at the stack of papers, rows of typed words, and felt both small and powerful all at once. If he comes back later and tries to claim the house, I asked quietly, can he do anything? She smiled. Not if you do this today. From now on, this home is yours, and yours alone. I held the pen, my hand trembling slightly. It felt like I was signing an agreement with life itself. As the ink touched the page, I whispered, "This is my home. No one will take it again." Jasmine looked at me, her voice soft but firm. "Eleanor, you think you failed as a mother, but you haven't. What you're doing takes courage, standing up without stepping on anyone." I let out a small laugh, feeling strangely light. "I don't want revenge, Jasmine. I just want peace." She nodded. Real justice doesn't always happen in a courtroom. Sometimes, it happens the moment we stop letting people hurt us. We hugged before saying goodbye. When I stepped outside, the Charleston sky was clearer than I'd seen it in months. I felt something shift inside me, not joy, but strength. That night, I organized all my documents. Deeds, insurance papers, bills. For the first time in a long while, I felt safe. As I changed the locks, I thought, if they come back, they won't find the same mother who cried. They'll find a woman who knows her worth. The next morning, I walked through the neighborhood. Mrs. Carroll spotted me smiling and called out, "Who's made you so happy, Eleanor?" I grinned, half joking, half proud. I just met my lawyer, and I think I've signed a contract with justice. Carol burst out laughing. "Good for you! It's about time you started thinking about yourself." That evening, I lit a candle on the porch, brewed mint tea, and opened my notebook. I wrote, Day 30. I signed it. Not just papers, but a promise to myself. From today on, I am no longer a victim. I closed the book and looked out the window. The moonlight reflected off the freshly painted walls, showing my reflection, small but unshakable. In that quiet moment, I knew my life had entered a new chapter. People often think justice only lives inside a courtroom, but really, it begins with a single act of courage. The moment you choose to protect yourself. And from that night on, I never felt alone again. If you've ever had to sign a hard decision, to walk away from what hurt you or to stand up after betrayal, you know this feeling. Leave a comment if you agree that protecting yourself is also a form of justice. And if you want to follow the journey of women who rise through pain and rediscover their strength, hit the follow button. Because every story here is a reminder. We were never weak. We just hadn't realized how strong we truly are. A few weeks later, I'd grown used to the quiet. Each morning, I brewed tea, opened the door to let in the sunlight, and picked a few fresh roses from the garden. Everything inside the house was neat, clean, and peaceful. The kind of peace that doesn't feel empty, but earned after a storm. But one afternoon, as I was arranging flowers in a vase, my phone rang. The name on the screen made my heart tighten. Devin. 3 months of silence, and now he was calling. I took a deep breath and answered. Son? His voice trembled. Mom, how are you? I'm fine. And you? Mom, I don't really know where to start. We're having some trouble. I gripped the phone. What kind of trouble, Devin? He hesitated. Could you lend us $5,000? Just until we get back on our feet. Candace lost her job, and my pay's been cut. I said nothing for a moment, watching the breeze move the new curtains on the porch. Then I asked, what about your mother-in-law? She's wealthy, isn't she? His voice cracked. She can't help us right now. Please, Mom, just this once. I gave a faint, calm smile.
Do you remember what I told you the day you left? That happiness doesn't live in big houses. Maybe now you understand. Mom, I know, but... I interrupted softly. Devin, I'm not angry. But I won't send you money. Not because I'm selfish, because you need to learn how to stand on your own, like I did. Silence. Then his voice, small and shaky. I understand, Mom. No, Devin, I said gently but firmly. Not yet. But one day you will. I hung up, set the phone on the table, and a single tear fell, not from pain this time, but from release. 3 days later, Jasmine stopped by, holding a folder. I did some digging on Vivian Sterling, she said, placing it on the table. That mansion? It's not hers. It's a rental under a company that owes the bank money, and she's under investigation for tax evasion. My eyes widened. Are you serious? Completely, Jasmine replied. And there's more. She's been charging your son and daughter-in-law living expenses every month, like rent. Clever woman. Using their money while pretending to be generous. I leaned back, taking it in. So all that luxury Candace bragged about was just a facade. I didn't feel vindicated or angry, just light, as if truth itself had quietly set me free. Jasmine added, Eleanor, women like her live for appearances. When the illusion breaks, they crumble. Let the law do its job. You just protect yourself. I nodded slowly. I won't interfere. I believe in karma. That night, I sat on the porch, listening to the rain on the roof. I pictured Candace in that grand house, lights dim, a half-empty wine glass shaking in her hand. And Devin, perhaps realizing that the people who once laughed with him were now gone. The light they chased was only an illusion. A week later, Devin texted me. Mom, I'm sorry for disappointing you. We're trying to get by. I stared at the message for a long time, then replied, It's all right, son. I'm fine. I just hope you've learned something from this. No lecture, no blessing. I just wanted life to teach him what my words never could. A few days later, Jasmine called again. Eleanor, just so you know, the bank sent a foreclosure notice to Vivian Sterling. The papers will hit the news soon. I sighed. Everything catches up eventually. Thank you, Jasmine.
The next morning at the farmer's market, Ruth waved me over. "Eleanor, did you read the paper?" I shook my head. She handed me a folded newspaper. On the front page was Vivian Sterling's photo, her once proud face beneath the headline, "Charleston Socialite Under Tax Fraud Investigation." Ruth clicked her tongue. "Shows you. Better to be honest than rich." I folded the paper and smiled. No one escapes their karma, Ruth. It just comes, sooner or later. That afternoon, while sweeping leaves from the yard, the delivery truck stopped at my gate. "Package for Mrs. Whitford," the man said. I opened it. Inside was a short letter and a $50 bill. "Mom, I know you won't take money from me, but this is what I still owed you. It's small, but it's a start. I'm sorry." I smiled softly, folding the letter. That $50 meant more to me than any fortune. It was proof that my son was finally learning his lesson. That night I sat by the window, moonlight shining across the roof. I opened my notebook and wrote, Day 45. I don't need to do anything. The truth always finds its way home. I looked up at the sky, feeling lighter than ever. A few days later, Jasmine stopped by again, coffee in hand. "See? Everything's falling into place. What about you? What's next?" I shrugged with a smile. "I'll keep planting flowers, making jam, and waiting to see what life brings next." Jasmine grinned. "If anyone calls you weak, send them to me. I'll show them the papers you signed. That's proof of strength." We both laughed, and I realized it had been a long time since I'd laughed like that. That night, I brewed ginger tea and scrolled through the news. Next to me, Luna, the little cat Marcus gave me, curled up, purring softly. I stroked her back and whispered, "We're okay now, aren't we?" I don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I know this much. Every time I choose to stand up, the world shifts with me. If you've ever found your voice again after a long silence, I want to hear your story. Share it in the comments, because maybe your words will give someone else the courage to begin again. I was sitting on the porch, gently stroking my little cat when the first heavy rain of the season began to fall. It came fast and fierce, sheets of water slamming against the roof as if trying to wash away the quiet I had worked so hard to build over the past few months. I stood up to close the windows when I heard the screech of brakes outside my gate. At first, I thought one of the neighbors had trouble, but when I peeked through the crack in the door, my heart clenched. Devin and Candace. They stood there in the rain, each holding a soaked suitcase. Their clothes clung to them, faces pale and desperate. Candace's usual arrogance was gone. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her eyes red and swollen. Devin's head hung low, his hair dripping, unable to find words. I opened the window but didn't step outside. The cold wind whipped the rain against my face. Candace's voice trembled. "Please, could you let us in? Just for one night, I'm begging you." I stood there for a long moment, saying nothing. The iron gate rattled in the wind. "Devin," I said slowly, "I thought you were living in that beautiful mansion. Why are you here, standing in the rain?" He lifted his head, eyes hollow. "Mom, we have nowhere else to go. My mother-in-law was arrested. The house was seized. We have nothing left. I felt nothing at first, just an empty space inside." Then Candace spoke, her voice breaking. "You can hate me, curse me, but please, don't make us stay out here. I was wrong. I know that now." The rain pounded harder, echoing like a heartbeat. I remembered the night Candace once stood in this exact spot, smirking as she called me poor and useless. And now, here she was,
kneeling in the same place, begging to come in. Devin took a step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, I'm sorry. This is all my fault. I was blind. I thought I could protect her, but I couldn't protect anyone, not even you." I looked at him, his face gaunt, eyes dark with sleeplessness. He wasn't the confident young man who once walked away. He was a man finally broken by the weight of his own choices. I cracked the door slightly. The warm light from inside spilled out onto the wet ground. They both looked at me with fragile hope. But instead of stepping aside, I said softly, "You left this place once, saying it was the house of poverty and failure.
And now you've come back. What do you bring with you besides tears?" Candace's voice quivered. "Say whatever you want, but please, don't leave us out here." I took a deep breath. "No, Candace. The rain will stop. But when a heart freezes over, it's not so easily thawed." I slowly closed the door. Behind it, I could still hear the rain and her sobs. Devin knocked gently once, his voice calm and resigned. "Mom, I understand. Do what you need to do." I stayed there, hand on the lock, tears streaming down my face. But I didn't open the door. Not because I stopped loving them, but because I'd finally learned that forgiveness doesn't always mean letting someone back in. Sometimes it just means choosing not to hate anymore. A moment later, I heard the car start. Through the curtain, I saw the red taillights blur in the rain. Candace turned to look back once, her face a mix of regret and despair. I knew they wouldn't go far, maybe find shelter somewhere nearby, but I also knew I couldn't save them from the consequences they had created. The next morning, the sky cleared. The road outside was still wet, tire tracks etched across the dirt. I made a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, feeling both heavy and light. I wasn't vengeful. I wasn't triumphant. For the first time, I simply felt strong. Mrs. Carroll passed by and waved. "Eleanor, I saw your son's car last night." "Did you let them in?" I smiled faintly and shook my head. "No, Carol. This time, I chose to let them learn how to knock before everything falls apart." She looked at me thoughtfully, then sighed. "I don't know if I'd have the strength to do that." "I didn't either," I said quietly. "But eventually, you have to choose. Save them or save yourself." That day I swept the porch clean, picking up leaves left by the storm. A small ache still lingered, but peace filled most of the space it once occupied. Maybe this was what Jasmine meant when she spoke about emotional justice, the kind that doesn't need a courtroom, just the courage to stand tall. That evening, a text appeared on my phone from an unknown number. "Mom, we're okay. Thank you for not opening the door." Maybe I needed that to understand. I smiled softly, set the phone down, and whispered, "At last, you're starting to understand." I lit a candle and placed it before my late husband's photo. "You see," I whispered, "I did it. I'm not that weak woman anymore." The flame flickered gently, as if he were smiling back. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, just the soft hum of wind and the faint scent of lavender. The next morning, when I stepped outside, Luna was lying in the sunlight, her fur glowing warm gold. I sat beside her, ran my hand over her back, and said, "We're still here, Luna." And as for them,
They'll have to find their way back to themselves, just like I did. If you were me, if the ones who once hurt you came back in desperation, would you open the door? Or would you protect the peace you fought so hard to build? Tell me in the comments what you'd do. Because sometimes, a single honest answer can be the light that warms the heart of a mother, still learning to be strong in silence. I still remember that day. The sun over Charleston was dazzling, almost too bright to look at. After that stormy night, I knew I had stepped into a new chapter of my life, one where I no longer looked back on the past with tears, but with the calm acceptance of someone who had survived the hurt and learned to let go. The house was dry and spotless now, filled with the faint scent of roses and lavender I loved. Everything was peaceful, but peace didn't mean loneliness. That morning I heard a gentle knock. When I opened the door, Marcus stood there, holding a wicker basket. "Morning, ma'am. I brought you some fresh pastries. Had extras from the cafe." I smiled. "You're too thoughtful. But you know, I'm not an easy customer to please." He laughed. "I know. But someone like you deserves good pastries." I invited him in and poured tea. We sat on the porch, looking out at the garden. Marcus pointed toward the rose bushes. "You've got a gift for growing these. They look so alive." I nodded. "They used to wilt for a long time, but when I started cutting away the dead branches, they bloomed again. Maybe people are the same. Sometimes we have to let go of what's rotting inside us to live again." Marcus looked at me, his eyes full of quiet respect. "You know, you're stronger than most young people I've met." I smiled faintly. Strength doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. It means you keep standing, even when it does. That afternoon, I stopped by the small church down the street. Pastor Michael, the kind old minister, greeted me with his familiar smile. "Eleanor, it's been a while." "Yes, I've been busy fixing my house and my life." He chuckled softly. "That's good to hear. But you know, forgiveness isn't about freeing others, it's about freeing yourself." I looked at him and said quietly, "I've tried to forgive, but a small part of me still isn't at peace." "That's all right," he said gently. "Forgiveness is a process. As long as you're walking toward peace, you're already on the right path." That night I wrote in my notebook, "Day 60. I think I'm learning to live again, one piece at a time. Maybe kindness needs training, just like muscles do." The next morning, Ruth stopped by, holding a small, fluffy white dog. "Eleanor, meet my new friend, Lucy." I rescued her from the shelter. I smiled, petting the dog's soft head. "Seems both of you were rescued, Ruth." She chuckled. "Maybe we all were. We've both been left behind, and now we're learning how to love again." That afternoon, we baked together and shared stories. Ruth told me about her late husband, who died of cancer, and how she couldn't leave the house for months afterward. "I thought I'd never make it," she said. "But one morning, I decided to bake. The smell of sugar and butter made me realize I was still alive." I sat there quietly. Every woman, it seemed, had her own way to survive. For Ruth, it was baking. For me, it was flowers and words. That evening, as I fed Luna, I noticed an envelope slipped under my door. No name on it. I opened it. It was a note, written in a shaky hand. "Mom, I don't have the courage to call. I just want you to know we're trying again. Candace is looking for a job. I'm working construction. I know we hurt you. But thank you for not opening the door that night. If you still care, just pray for us. Don't worry." I set the letter down, my chest tight. I knew I'd done the right thing. Sometimes a mother's love isn't about taking her children back, but about letting them face what they created so they can grow. The next morning, I took the letter outside and lit it gently. The paper curled, turned gold, and drifted away as ash. I whispered, "I'll pray for you, Devin. But I'll pray for myself too, to be at peace." In the days that followed, I focused on making jam to sell at the farmer's market. Ruth helped label the jars. Marcus drove me there. People loved the jam, and for the first time in years, I earned a little money. A young woman asked me, "What's your secret, ma'am? How did you do it?" I smiled. "Never let anyone convince you you're not enough." She grinned, and in that moment, I felt as though I was passing on the little flame that life once tried to snuff out. One evening, as we packed up after the market, Marcus asked, "Have you ever thought about opening your own shop?" I blinked. "A jam shop?" He nodded. "Yes, you've got your own flavor, and your story is your brand. I can help you set up an online page." I laughed. "Me? A 64-year-old woman running an online business?" Marcus shrugged. "Age doesn't matter, Eleanor. You've got a story, and people want to hear it." His words stayed with me. For years, I'd only ever been a storyteller in my kitchen, telling bedtime stories to my son. Maybe now it was time to tell my own story. Not to complain, but to inspire. That night, I opened my laptop and began typing the first lines of Eleanor's Garden Jams. I wrote about the jars born from my little garden, about a woman who was abandoned but never defeated. When I finally clicked post, my heart raced, not with fear, but excitement. A week later, my stall at the market was busier than ever. People didn't just buy jam. They came to talk. "Aren't you the woman from that article, the mother left behind in Charleston?" one asked. I smiled. "That's me. But I'm not left behind anymore." That afternoon, Pastor Michael stopped by, looking around with pride. "You've done well, Eleanor." "God gives storms so we can discover our strength," I smiled gently. "I think you're right, Father. Without that storm, I might still believe I needed someone else to survive." That evening, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset settle over the street. A flock of birds perched on the wires, chirping joyfully. Luna curled up in my lap, warm and soft. I whispered, "Peace isn't the absence of storms. It's learning how to stay calm through them." If you've ever stood up after being broken, if you've ever rebuilt your life with your own hands, I know you understand this feeling. Share in the comments what made you stronger today, because maybe your story will be the light that helps someone else rise again. I never expected that the little stories I shared online would change the direction of my life. One Saturday morning, just as I opened my stall at the market, a well-dressed woman approached me. She introduced herself as Grace Holloway, an editor for a local magazine that features stories about inspiring women. "Mrs. Eleanor, right? I read your story on Charleston Hearts. Would you allow us to write a feature about your journey? Your story has moved so many people, I was taken aback." All my life, I'd been just an ordinary woman, working, raising a child, enduring, and then standing back up. But Grace smiled warmly and said, "No one is ordinary when they have the courage to overcome what others believe they can't." So I agreed. The following week, Grace and a young photographer came to visit. The boy couldn't stop admiring my garden. "You grow these so beautifully, ma'am. The light hits the roses like a movie scene." I chuckled. Every flower here grew from soil I once thought was beyond saving. Grace took notes non-stop, asking about everything, from the day I was kicked out of my own home to the moment I decided to rebuild my life. I told her everything, but not with bitterness, with gratitude for rebirth. When we finished, she squeezed my hand and said, "You know, your story will help people see a bit of themselves in you." A few weeks later, the magazine came out. My photo filled the center spread, me standing on my porch, Luna in my arms, sunlight flooding the garden behind me. The headline read, "The Mother Who Turned Abandonment into Strength." The article spread faster than I imagined. Strangers wrote letters, saying they felt comforted and inspired. One woman even shared that after reading it, she finally left an abusive marriage and dared to start over. I never wanted fame, but being understood, that warmed my heart. One afternoon, as I was packing up at the market, a man in his 50s approached, holding a worn copy of the magazine. "Mrs.
Eleanor?" he asked, his voice calm and polite. "I'm Ken Davis, chief accountant at a local firm." "I read your story. Could I ask for some advice? My wife passed away and I'm trying to start over, but it's harder than I thought." I invited him to sit, poured some tea, and listened. I didn't realize it then, but I had become someone people sought out for peace. Ken was unlike any man I'd known. He didn't talk much, didn't boast. He just listened. After that day, he stopped by the stall every week, sometimes to buy a jar of jam, sometimes just to say hello. One day he asked hesitantly, "I know this might seem out of the blue, but would you have dinner with me? Nothing fancy. I'll cook." I laughed. "A man who cooks? That's rare," he smiled. "A woman like you deserves a meal made for her." Dinner that night was in his cozy little house, filled with the scent of wood and old jazz. On the table was baked salmon, mashed potatoes, and a bottle of cheap wine he said was more honest than the expensive kind. We talked about loneliness, loss, and the simple truth that healing doesn't come from miracles. It comes from daring to open your heart again. I came home late, my emotions tangled. I wasn't young anymore, and I wasn't looking for love. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid of someone wanting to step into my life. After that, Ken kept visiting, helping me organize my books, track sales, calculate costs. He never offered pity, only quiet steadiness, as if he knew I needed stability, not sympathy. Then one morning, while I was watering the flowers, Mrs. Carroll hurried over waving a newspaper. "Eleanor, did you see? They arrested more people in the Vivian Sterling case." I took the paper, my heart tightening. The headline read, "Tax Fraud Investigation Expands. Vivian Sterling among those charged." I set the paper down and looked out at my garden. The sun was bright, but my heart felt cold, not with anger, but with sadness for those who chose the wrong path. I thought of Devin and Candace. Had they heard? Were they caught in it too? I prayed they weren't. That night, Jasmine called. "Eleanor, I just got the official word from the court. Vivian's being charged with 5 counts of tax fraud. She'll serve at least 5 years. But Devin's clear. He and Candace were victims, not accomplices." I was silent. "Jasmine, do you think this will make Devin realize anything?" She paused. "Maybe. But what matters most is that you already have. You've learned you don't have to save anyone anymore." After hanging up, I sat by the window, moonlight spilling across the floor. Luna curled up in my lap. I whispered, "You're right, Jasmine. I won't save anyone anymore, but I'll still pray for their peace." A week later, a handwritten letter arrived from Devin. "Mom, I know you've seen the news about my mother-in-law. I just want you to know I don't blame anyone anymore. We found a small apartment. Candace cleans offices now, and I'm working construction at the docks. We're learning how to live honestly. Please believe I'm not the same person I was." I read it over and over. The handwriting trembled, but the words were sincere. Candace had even added a few lines. Eleanor, I don't expect forgiveness, but I understand now. I once mocked your calloused hands. Now my own are rough from scrubbing floors. Thank you for letting me learn this lesson the hard way. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer beside my late husband's old ones. Outside, the evening light cast a soft gold over the blooming roses. I whispered, finally, something good is growing from what once was broken. That night I brewed ginger tea, sat on the porch, and wrote in my notebook. Day 90. Forgiveness isn't about opening the door for someone else. It's about opening your heart so you can step out of the dark. If you've ever found light inside your own wounds, I hope you don't keep your story to yourself. Subscribe and stay with me so we can keep sharing stories of strength and healing. Because who knows, maybe the next story will be yours. The days that followed drifted by as gently as the surface of a morning lake. I still sold jam at the market, still tended to my flowers, still wrote a few lines in my journal every night. Life had become light again. But deep down, I knew the thread between Devin and me hadn't been completely severed. A mother's love never truly disappears. It simply lies dormant, waiting for the right moment to be called by name again. One early October afternoon, Ruth came by with a bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums. "Eleanor," she said, her eyes bright with something between surprise and excitement. "Have you heard? Your son was at church this morning." I froze. "Devin?" She nodded. "Yes, he helped Pastor Michael clean the storage room, and he asked about you. He said he wants to come see you, but he's not sure you'd want to see him." My heart tangled into a knot. I'd spent months learning to live without him, and yet one single sentence brought the ache rushing back. I didn't know if I was ready, but if fate wanted to give us another chance, I would face it with the clearest heart I could. 2 days later, as I was watering the garden, I saw a familiar old car pull up to the gate. I recognized it instantly, not with my eyes, but with a mother's instinct. Devin stepped out, holding a cardboard box, looking uncertain and alone. Candace wasn't with him. I didn't open the gate. I just stood on the porch. "Hi, Mom," he said softly, his voice carrying both nerves and gratitude. "I don't want to bother you. I just came to give you this." I looked at the box. "What is it?" "House papers. Everything's officially under your name. I also signed a legal waiver giving up any inheritance claim. I want you to know, no one can ever touch this house again." For a moment, I couldn't move. All these years, I'd feared losing this house as if it were part of my soul. And now, the same son who had once abandoned me stood there, promising to protect it. I unlocked the gate. Devon stepped in, but didn't come too close. "Mom, I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said quietly. "I just want you to know I'm changing." I looked at his thin face and said softly, "Devon, what hurt me most wasn't losing the house. It was the way you turned your back." He lowered his eyes. "I know. Every time I drive through this neighborhood, I feel too ashamed to even look." I stepped closer. "I don't need your guilt. I just need you to understand that happiness doesn't come from what we own, but from how we treat the people who gave us everything." He nodded, eyes glistening. "Mom, Candace found a job cleaning offices downtown. She says every time she wipes a desk, she thinks about what you said about dignity. She wanted to write to you, but She's not brave enough yet. I took a deep breath. She doesn't need to. If she's living honestly now, that's enough. We sat together on the porch, the same place where I had once cried through endless nights. But this time, no tears fell. Devon told me about his new job, the long hours, the cuts on his hands. I listened quietly, no judgment, no interruption. "Mom," he said finally, "whenever I feel tired, I think about you. I wonder how you managed all those years alone without breaking." I looked toward the garden, where the roses were blooming in the sun. "By planting one seed every day," I said. "When you care for something small, there's no room left for loneliness." He was silent for a while, then pulled an envelope from his pocket. "I know you don't need it, but Candace and I want to send a little money each month. Not because you need help, because we owe you." I smiled gently. "I won't take it out of pity, but if it comes from gratitude, I'll accept it as a gift." Devon smiled, and for the first time in years, his smile reached his eyes. Before leaving, he said, "Mom, next week we're volunteering at the church. Candace and I are cooking for the homeless. Would you come? I'd like you to see we're trying to live right." I didn't promise, just said, "I'll think about it." But deep down, I already knew I would go. A week later, I stepped into the church kitchen, where the smell of soup and the sound of laughter filled the air. Devon was chopping vegetables, sleeves rolled up, face glowing with calm purpose. Near the stove stood Candace, her hair tied back, her face thinner, her eyes soft with emotion when she saw me. I walked up and simply said, "Need an extra pair of hands?" Candace hesitated, then smiled faintly. "If you'd like, you can help me with the salad." I nodded, rolled up my sleeves, and joined her. The two women who once despised each other now stood side by side, slicing quietly. After a while, Candace said softly, "You know, every time I scrub floors or wash dishes, I think, if only I'd learned to take pride in small things, back then, maybe life would have been different." I replied gently, "It's never too late to start over." She lowered her eyes. "Thank you for not hating me forever." I didn't answer. I simply placed a hand on her shoulder for a moment, and that was enough. Later, after everyone had cleaned up, Devon called me outside. "Mom," he said, "thank you for coming. Candace told me she's never seen you smile this much before." I looked at him, the golden light of sunset on his face, and for the first time, I saw the boy he once was, kind, humble, and good. "Devon," I said slowly, "forgiveness doesn't happen in a day. But today, I saw that you're truly walking the right path. I'm proud of you." Tears shimmered in his eyes as he hugged me, not tightly, just enough for me to feel his warmth, the familiar heartbeat I thought I'd lost. I didn't pull away or hug him back. Some embraces don't need to be complete to be whole. That night back home, I sat by the window and wrote another line in my old notebook. Day 120. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't start with words, but with actions. Today I saw my son do what I'd prayed for, bow his head, make things right, and live with kindness. I closed the notebook and looked at Luna sleeping on the chair. Outside, the moon shone bright and steady. Inside me, a strange, beautiful feeling bloomed. Not joy, not sorrow, but the quiet peace of someone who has weathered every storm and finally found the sunrise within her own heart. I sat by the window for a long time, watching the moonlight spill slowly across the wooden table. And in that quiet moment, I knew my journey had reached a turning point. Not an ending, but the beginning of complete peace.
The lonely nights and silent mornings had passed. Now, there was only a strange, gentle calm. I no longer measured time by pain, but by the small, warm moments life kept returning to me. The next morning, Pastor Michael invited me to a Community Day celebration at the church, a special gathering to honor women who had helped change the community. I haven't planned on going, but Ruth and Marcus insisted. "If you don't come," Ruth teased, "who's going to accept the flowers? Everyone at the market knows you turned pain into purpose." When I walked into the hall, I froze. Dozens of eyes turned toward me. In the front row sat Jasmine, Grace, Ruth, and Marcus, the people who had entered my life like small lamps lighting the darkest roads. And in the very back row, I saw Devin and Candace. They sat quietly, smiling, not with pride or shame, but with simple gratitude. Pastor Michael stepped to the podium and spoke in his steady, warm voice. "Today we honor women who refuse to let darkness harden their hearts. Among them is a woman whose story taught us how to love again, how to stand up again, and how to forgive. That woman is Mrs. Eleanor Whitford." Applause filled the hall. My hands trembled as I stood. Pastor Michael handed me a bouquet of white chrysanthemums and said, "What's remarkable about you, Eleanor, isn't how much you've endured. It's that you chose forgiveness instead of bitterness. Your compassion turned justice into something human, and your grace gave others the courage to return home." I stepped to the microphone and looked at the faces before me. Jasmine, with tears in her eyes. Marcus, smiling proudly. Ruth, dabbing her cheeks with a handkerchief. And at the very back, Devin nodded slightly, his eyes soft. My voice shook at first. I never imagined I'd stand here. I was once a mother, abandoned by her own son. I thought life had taken everything from me. But then I learned, no one is ever truly left behind, as long as they still believe in kindness. I paused, then spoke again, my tone steadier. I'm not here to talk about pain. I'm here to say that forgiveness is the strength of those who have been broken. When we forgive, we don't let others win. We simply stop losing ourselves. I may have lost much, but in return, I found something far greater than possessions. I found peace. The hall fell completely silent. I saw Candace lower her head as tears slid down her cheeks, and Devin took her hand tightly. When I stepped down, they came forward together. Candace whispered, "Thank you for not turning pain into hatred." I rested my hand gently on her shoulder. I know what it feels like to be hurt. That's why I refuse to pass it on. Devin's voice trembled. "Mom, I don't know what to say except thank you for not locking the door forever." I smiled, and for the first time in years pulled him into my arms, tightly, not to hold on, but to let go. In that embrace, I was no longer the betrayed mother, but the woman who had reclaimed her dignity through grace. When the ceremony ended, everyone came to congratulate me. Grace said, "Eleanor, your words will make hundreds of women reread their own lives." Jasmine added softly, "You just proved that justice isn't only in the law. It's in how we choose to live." That night I came home late. The white chrysanthemums still glowed faintly on the table. Luna slept beside them, stirring as I sat down to write. Day 150. I'm no longer someone searching for justice. I've become proof that sometimes justice is simply another word for compassion. I set the pen down and glanced at the photo of my late husband on the shelf. The candlelight shimmered across his face. "Do you see, love?" I whispered. "I did it. I kept the house, I kept my heart, and I kept love, even after it was broken." A soft night breeze slipped through the window, carrying the scent of lavender from the garden. I listened to the rustle of leaves. It sounded like the whisper of years gone by. Inside me, Everything finally felt whole. A few weeks later, I reopened my little stall at the market. A young woman approached, holding a jar of jam. "Mrs. Eleanor," she said, smiling shyly, "I read your story. Because of you, I left a bad marriage. You made me believe that no matter our age, we can always begin again." I handed her an extra jar and said, "Take this one too. Whenever you taste it, remember, life can be sweet again if you stir the bitterness long enough." Days passed, simple and steady. Ruth and I opened a small corner of the market called the Garden of Hope, a space for women who had been hurt to share their stories, cook together, make jam, and raise funds for those in need. Marcus built the sign, Jasmine offered legal help, and Ken managed the books. None of us did anything grand, but together, we built something that would last. One afternoon, I stood at the door of our little shop, watching the sunlight dance through the rows of shining jars. Peace washed over me. I was no longer the mother who was left behind, the woman once written about in the papers. I was simply Eleanor Whitford, the woman who learned to forgive, to live kindly, and to pass on her strength. I lifted my head and smiled. The Charleston sky above me stretched wide and blue, brighter than it had ever been. And I realized, even after the storm, life can shine again if we are brave enough to keep believing in the light within our own hearts. And so, the story of Mrs. Eleanor Whitford came to a close, not with tears nor with resentment, but with the light of grace and peace. From a mother betrayed by her own son and daughter-in-law, cast out of the very home she built with her own hands, she chose not revenge, not bitterness, but to rise again with steadfastness, kindness, and faith in the quiet justice of the heart. Through lonely nights, through storms of humiliation, and through mornings of renewal, Eleanor proved that age is never a limit to strength, and that forgiveness is not weakness. It is the highest form of courage. She did not win through anger, but through calm, compassion, and unshakable dignity. The little house in Charleston, once a symbol of betrayal, has now become a place of hope, where hands once torn apart have found their way back together, and where every woman learns that she can rebuild herself from the ashes. Eleanor's story reminds us that, when we are hurt, silence doesn't mean fear. It means we understand that truth doesn't need noise to prove itself. And when we dare to forgive, to stand tall, to live better than before, that is the truest form of justice life can give. Thank you for staying until the end of this emotional journey. If Eleanor's story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share this video to spread the message. No one is ever truly left behind, as long as there's still goodness in their heart. See you in the next story, another journey of love, kindness, and the quiet justice of women who dare to live truthfully.